Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm not sure how many of you know me. I know Pat knows me, but if you have never met me before, I am the Web Services and Distance Learning Librarian here. I've been involved with the Accessibility Work Group on campus since its inception back in 2016. And very recently, this past summer, I got really interested in learning about different models of disability, how we view disability, and how those sort of manifest in higher education. So the past times that I've done this presentation, I'd say the presentation part took maybe 25 minutes or so. So we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. But feel free to ask any questions. Probably it's easier for me if you type them out in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to discuss a few different models of disability. We're going to talk about the religious or moral model of disability, the medical model of disability, the social model of disability, interactional models of disability, and the identity model of disability. Then we're going to talk a little bit about disability within higher education, a little bit about the discussion of the student experience, and how these different models that we're going to discuss sort of play out in higher education. So I'm going to use the acronym PWD throughout the presentation. This is short for person or people with disability or disabilities, plural. Since it's a mouthful of a phrase, it's easier to just say PWD, and it's a very common acronym. So the religious or moral model of disability is the oldest one. In the past, disability was viewed as a punishment. If it was something that somebody was born with, then it was the fault of the parents, or even further back in the family, it was the result of some sin on their part. And if the disability appeared later in life, then it was the person with the disability that had sinned. Another sort of take on this was a disability as a test of faith. And it's been a while since I read sections of the Bible, but I feel like they're biblical stories that fit this sort of concept of disability as a test of faith. If the disability goes away, then the person with a disability has passed this test of faith. And if it remains, then they have failed. Another sort of take on this model is disability as a gift, that is an opportunity for character development. And I really liked this quote at the bottom of the slide. Disability impairs one sense, it heightens another, often to mythic proportions. This image is legion in fiction, films, and medicine. And the example of this that comes to mind for me is the Marvel superhero Daredevil. And there were, I believe, 3 seasons of the show on Netflix. And there's actually a line from the series finale about, maybe it was meant to be that I am blind, because it helped me save all these people and stuff. I don't have the exact quote visible right now. It's in my presentation notes. But to me, that was just a very, very obvious example of, this sort of how his blindness was actually, made his other senses more heightened and so forth. So the most common model nowadays is the medical or biomedical model of disability. It began to emerge in the mid-19th century. And under this model, disability is something more of a personal problem that requires a solution. So something that can be fixed. There's been a lot of research, even recent research, that that this is still the most common view of disability in the US. Most of the disability laws in the US are kind of based on this idea. And as a result, most of our practices are also based on this model. So there are a lot of weaknesses to this model. First, it implies that disabled bodies are inferior. It also implies that disabilities can be neatly defined and measured. And as someone personally, I have some chronic illnesses and they often do not fit in, this prescribed box. And a lot of disabilities are like that. It also implies disabilities are rare, which they are not. The CDC statistics, and I think this is for ages 18 to 64, it's roughly 1 in 5 people have disabilities. So it's really not rare. And it also ignores the social and environmental barriers to people with disabilities. So the next model we're going to discuss, the social model of disability, is really directly in opposition to the medical model. It's relatively new compared to the other two models. It was formed in the early 70s by a man called Paul Hunt. He helped start this organization called Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And as I understand it, Paul Hunt had been institutionalized and he just wanted to be able to, live on his own and have some basically power over his own life. And the idea behind the social model is that impairments are one thing and disability is another, and disability is caused solely by the social conditions, meaning that the social conditions, whether they're environmental or, the way we think about disability, people with disabilities are excluded because of these social conditions. As I mentioned earlier, there's a focus on independence and self-determination. The weaknesses of this model is that it does imply any negative effects of impairment are only due to exclusion and discrimination. And as someone with a disability myself, personally, I know I don't feel that all of the negative effects of my hearing impairment are due to social things. And not everyone with impairments is excluded, especially if you consider impairments that are not necessarily easy to see. Even though hearing impairment is a very common disability, I have hearing aids and, if you are watching me on video, you probably wouldn't be able to see them. And, people probably, if my hair's down covering it, it's something of an invisible, to some extent, disability. And I know that I personally have not felt the societal exclusion. So those are just some of the weaknesses of this model. However, this is a really important model, and it has created a bunch of sort of related models. The first one that I'm going to talk about of these related models is the socio-political or minority group model, and it was developed by Hahn in the 80s. And he said that the primary source of the problems that people with disabilities face can be traced to unfavorable attitudes on the part of those who are not disabled. And that all aspects of the environment are fundamentally shaped by public policy, and that policies tend to reflect pervasive social attitudes and values. I don't have the citation at the front of my mind. I believe it's in the list of citations I have at the end of this presentation. But there has been research, I believe it's specifically on college faculty, where their feelings and knowledge of disability did influence their own course policies and how they felt about university policies as well. So there is research backing up what Hahn has proposed. The next model is the human variations or diversity model, which was developed in the late 90s. And the idea here is that disability is just part of the natural variability of the human species. They also say that many social institutions may not currently have the ability or capacity to respond to that variability, but they all have the potential. It's probably a more positive and hopeful model than a lot of the other ones. And then the last of this group is the human rights model. And this came out of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Again, they are saying that disability is just a natural part of the human race. People with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else in society, and impairments must not, sorry, the captioning is covering the text here. But basically, it must not be used as an excuse to deny or restrict people's rights. So the next group of models we're going to discuss are the interactional models. The functional model looks at the interaction between the individual, the disability, and the functions of that individual. And this is a very subjective model, as you can see from my third bullet point, because the functions of the individual are going to be different. The environmental model just sort of takes that one step further, and it's looking at the disability, the person, their functions, but also the environment. And this quote here, the more ability someone has to function within their environment, the less their disability is relevant, is a good opener to a very interesting story about a community in Chilmark, which is a little town on the island of Martha's Vineyard. And what happened was, back in, say, the 1650s, I think, or just before then, a man who was congenitally deaf immigrated from England to Martha's Vineyard, to this little town. And as a result, his kids, as the population of that town grew, there was probably a higher rate of people who were congenitally deaf than, maybe the general population. And also, this town was fairly cut off from the rest of the island, and of course, outside of the island. And so what happened is the people living in this town actually developed a very early version of sign language, and pretty much everybody in the town learned it. So looking at this from the environmental perspective, because so many people, since it was pretty much, I don't know the exact amount, but I believe it was the majority of the people in the town knew this sign language. The hearing impairment was much less of a problem for the people who lived there, because it wasn't an accommodation. It was just something everybody knew. So that sort of leads into this next point, that each environment is different. Another example that comes to mind is, I think it's Gallaudet University, which is in, I believe, the DC area. And it is a university that serves deaf students. And so you can imagine that environment where that's the norm is going to be very different from someone at a university where the majority of the students and faculty are hearing. So it is really subjective. The main weakness of these models is that disability is seen as a drawback. Like most of the models, unfortunately, view it as a drawback. So the main related model here was developed by the World Health Organization, and it is the International Classification of Functioning Disability in Health, model, also sometimes called the biopsychosocial model. So again, they're recognizing disability as sort of multidimensional, where it's not just the person and their impairments, but also their functions, the environment, the restrictions they face. And I think it's interesting, they look at the environmental factors as, are they barriers or are they facilitators for this person's functioning? And so the last model we're going to discuss is the identity or cultural affiliation model of disability. This is one of the models that is positive. Like, I think anyone with a unique lived experience, just to mention my own, I'm a recovering alcoholic. And so that is an experience that only other recovering alcoholics would have. And so that's kind of the same idea here, that people with the lived experience of having a disability, they're an affinity group here. So that's what this model is based on. So it's less interested in fixing things and more focused on providing people with the community of people who have had that similar lived experience. Another point from this model is that some people with disabilities prefer to be called a disabled person or having their specific disability person. So for example, rather than a person with autism, they might prefer to be called an autistic person. And that puts the emphasis on the identity as opposed to personhood in general. The main drawback of this model is probably also one of the strengths, which is that it's less interested in the social influences or changing circumstances. It is really meant to sort of bolster that community. So that is sort of a quick overview of the main models. I'm not covering all of them, but these groupings are based on just the readings that I've done and where I found the similarities between those models. So talking about the experience of people with disabilities within higher education, the experiences of students with disabilities is incredibly different from what they experience in the K-12 environment. I've learned a lot about students with disabilities in the K-12 system from working with special education classes here on campus. And generally, there are these two different legal plans. There's the IEP, and I can't remember what the E stands for, but it's individual something plan. And the other, I believe, is Section 504. And basically, as I understand it, these are both plans that are put together by a group of people, basically within the school. It can involve like an occupational therapist, the students' teachers, parents. It is a community of people sort of trying to figure out what will work for that student, what they can do to help the student succeed. I think the students are not often consulted. I have an autistic friend with an autistic son, and his son, I believe, is 13 or 14, and he consults with his son about what he needs. And when this was shared at one of these meetings with this sort of team, at least one person was kind of surprised that the student was consulted. So I'd say that's a drawback of that experience, especially when you look at that when it's juxtaposed, I don't know if I said that word right, with the experience that students have when they get to college. Basically, you have this structural support when you're in the K-12 environment, but then when you get to college, you have to self-disclose. You often have to provide the documentation of the disability, and that can be a huge deterrent for students, just because, like, let's just take the example of Oswego here. Let's say a student needs this documentation. The specialist, there's no specialist in Oswego that knows about their conditions. So they have to go to Syracuse to see a doctor, or Rochester. And that takes time, and it takes money to pay for the appointment. So it can really be a deterrent and a stumbling block for students to be able to get these accommodations. And there is an article in the references of this presentation by Kat McFarlane, who argues about that we should either get rid of or reduce the amount of documentation required for disability. And John and Rebecca also interviewed Kat McFarlane for the T for Teaching podcast. So if you don't want to read the article, you can look for that podcast to learn more about that. Students often have to re-register each semester that they need accommodations. And the research that I've read shows that students will often, they may disclose at first, but then they stop disclosing later on, in their college career. Sometimes students choose not to disclose when they get to college because they're afraid of sort of the negative stigma that they might get from their peers or from professors. And there is some, pardon me if I'm repeating myself, there is some literature in the bibliography about that particular point, about why students don't disclose. And then for faculty and staff with disability, often there are no specific guidelines or resources for faculty and staff with disabilities. They're told to contact human resources if they need accommodations. And a lot of the information that's available online for faculty about disability is focused on how to accommodate students. And when you think about it, that's sending this very subtle message that people with disabilities don't tend to work at colleges or universities. They don't get to the level of faculty. So I think that's kind of this underlying message that we don't want to be sending. So higher education, like most of the rest of the country, tends to rely mostly on that medical model. There's a wonderful book. It's actually open access. You can download it for free. You can download a text, or I believe they also have a free audiobook version. The book is called Academic Ableism. And so this passage, this student spoke to this author and described the accommodation process as being like Battleship. You don't know what's on the other side of the board. You're just kind of guessing and hoping that you hit one of the ships. And apparently getting accommodations can be like this. And I'm sure this is not the case at every college, but sometimes you don't know what accommodation to ask for because you're not aware of what's available. There's also the myth of rarity, which I talked about in general with the medical model. And the statistics for students with disabilities is really very, very similar to the CDC statistics on adults with disabilities. The most recent statistics that the National Center for Education Statistics has is from 2015, 2016. And at that point, 19.4%, so 1 in 5 undergraduate students reported having a disability. And when you combine that with this idea that a lot of students don't disclose that they have a disability, it could be more than that. But I've definitely heard this comment, but there are no disabled students in my class. Well, you don't know that because there are a lot of invisible disabilities, and because you just don't know when they have chosen to disclose. They're not morally required to disclose to their faculty that they have a disability. Han's unfavorable attitudes are definitely also present. And just to remind you, that's the minority group model. I do have a few sources. The full citations are in the bibliography at the end, but Lyman et al. Identified 6 themes on why students choose not to disclose their disability status. And you'll notice that the ones that are bolded all sort of have to do with these unfavorable attitudes towards people with disabilities. So, they want to avoid negative social reactions. They've had negative experiences with professors, and they're fearful of ramifications. The interaction models are really not very common in higher education. There's really primarily a focus on on academics and academic performance. There was a medical student with a disability who had commented that accommodations don't often take care of accommodating people off campus. You can have someone help you to get to class, but if you can't get your groceries, how can you stay in school? And that quote just really struck me. What are the other functions that a student has? And we have to look at functions not just as basic, eating, taking care of bills and those sorts of things, but also social. How are we accommodating the social needs of students with disabilities? So I personally would like to see more focus on these kinds of functions within academia. And that is wonderful. Pat said that we can grant students accommodations while we wait for their documentation. So there's also this concept of ableist exceptionalism, which I had originally learned from that book, Academic Ableism. And it's this idea that the ideas and beliefs we have about other domains of political consciousness, so for example, racism, homophobia and stuff, we may be anti-racist, we may be someone very much in support of queer folks, but a lot of times that sort of consciousness is not transferred over to disability and ableism. And Dolmage, who wrote Academic Ableism, said, very progressive teachers, researchers, and even activists will use words like moron or idiot, even when they're critiquing racist, sexist, or otherwise offensive behavior. And there's also been research that shows that disability is often excluded from institutional discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sheaf et al. Did a study on this, found that less than a quarter of campus diversity statements explicitly included disability. There's also a report, and I believe the organization, I think it's Return on Disability. I know it's in the bibliography, but they have found that that's also the case in sort of wider industry. They looked at a lot of companies, mission statements, or statements about diversity, and many of them also excluded disability. So that concludes sort of the informational part of this presentation. I have some questions up here. You don't have to share your thoughts on these questions. These are just a few I had prepared ahead of time. So if you do have thoughts about these questions, feel free to share them. But if you have other questions or observations, also share those. You can see I have many, many, many references. So.
I just wanted to say I appreciate the breakdown of all of the models. I've recently read a book called Disability Visibility. It was an anthology of stories edited by Alice Wong. And I think that has really helped me to see a lot of how these models kind of apply in day-to-day situations and daily life. And then being disabled myself, I'm also starting to build like even my own education and knowledge of how things around me, especially with the pandemic, have changed quite a bit. And my perception of those things have started to shift a lot. So seeing the models here was really helpful for just understanding kind of the timeline and where things came about and different understandings. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate the layout of this because it was really helpful as I'm learning more myself.
Yeah, for me, like I said, I've been working with the accessibility work group here on campus since 2016, but I was working on an article with some other folks from that group, and I was trying to understand something one of my colleagues had written. So I asked her for a little bit more information, and she's like, look up the medical model of disability. So I started reading, and it was just a rabbit hole for me. To sort of understand this. And I've become pretty passionate about it. And I'm like, let me share this information anywhere I can. Mm-hmm. And, as someone with a disability, I personally think about the privilege I have because of my, the specific disability that I have, but also the fact that it came later in life. I got my first pair of hearing aids when I was like 32 or something. So, I didn't have to deal with any of that in school, either, K to 12, college and beyond, but also recognizing sort of the internalized ableism I have. And again, this is especially with my particular disability. I'm like, of course I want to fix this. Of course I want to be able to hear. So I think it is very interesting to sort of consider those things, even when you have a disability.
For sure. I think I've had to challenge a lot of what I think I've learned early on in my life. And then being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease right before the pandemic hits has really, I think, accelerated my learning. A lot of it has been personal experience, but then also, as I've learned, like you said before, just that rabbit hole of learning so many different people's experiences with varying disabilities, and then how some of those mythologies or, the social historical connections or our understandings of disability have really created some barriers for people to have their basic needs met. I don't know if anybody
If you
else
don't
has.
mind me picking on you, I will admit I don't know as much about what our personal Office of Accessibility Resources does. I know some of it, but if you wouldn't mind sharing some of the things that your office does.
Sure. Give me just a second. Ta-da. There we go. First of all, I definitely agree with you when you talk about documentation. People's access to testing, to doctors, to psychiatrists, psychologists, widely varies, widely. So one of the things that we do is we're able to provide what we call interim accommodations for students for basically an entire semester while they're working on securing that documentation. So that's something we can do and do on a frequent basis. So our process is this. Well, it might change a little bit, but this is what we've been doing is we ask students to register with our office. And that process is they will meet with either myself or our coordinator. They'll provide us documentation if they have it, and they'll complete a registration form. The most important piece of that is that face-to-face meeting, because that's where we're going to learn. I mean, I've read through 15 years here and about 30 years of doing this. I've read lots of reports. They don't tell me what I need to know. They tell me what somebody tested as. What I need to know is how this impacts the student, and the student will tell me that. And that's what I need to know. And that's how I'm best going to be able to help them. You're correct. They do need to register every semester. And a lot of that is their choice whether they want to use accommodations from semester to semester. That is really up to the student on how they want to handle that. Once we get all our information, we then electronically send a student an accommodation letter, which only lists the accommodations they receive to their Oswego email account. And then it's the student's choice to then send that to their instructors. Once the letter is sent to their instructors, that puts their accommodations in place for the entire semester. And then they decide if and when they ever use anything. Okay. Now, a biggie for us is what we see from high school to college, and I'm not picking on parents because I happen to be one, is the involvement of parents. In high school, you're right, Laura, 100%. It's a group, it's a treatment team, if you will. And usually parents are involved, and hopefully students are involved, hopefully. But when they come here, you're right, a student has to self-disclose. And it's really, when I meet with a student and parents, all my questions are directed at the student, all of them, because that's who I deal with. So that gives you a 5-second overview of what we do.
I know, I really do think it's something that is a responsibility of the whole campus to consider how we can support this and how we have, things that may facilitate or act as barriers. One thing that we've been working on for a few years, actually, within the library is just having study carrels that are accessible for people with wheelchairs or other mobility devices. And we also, the space between our shelves on the 3rd floor is also not wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs. Luckily, with the pandemic, we implemented a service that anyone can use where we will go up to the shelves and get the book and hold it at the checkout desk. So that at least is an alternative. That's really fairly recent. And that's something we want to change, but it's one of those things that, we have to wait until, because moving these huge, heavy things of books is not very easy. So we kind of have to wait until we have sort of larger facilities projects going on within the library. We are hoping, I think, in the next few months to be able to get the study carrels that will be more accessible. But, those are just some minor things or major things, depending on how you look at them. But it is, I think, something every office on campus can think about, especially just something as simple as, can the student get into the building? Can they access your office? One of my colleagues at another SUNY had mentioned that they have a ramp. The ramp is at the back of the building, which is kind of, I have to say that's one thing I like about our building is that anybody with a wheelchair comes in the front door just like anybody else. But at this other SUNY, the ramp is in the back, and because of the way it was constructed at the sort of curve in the ramp, that curve is actually not wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs. So it's basically, the whole ramp is useless because of a mismeasurement. So I think that's like one of the most straightforward ways to sort of consider, you know, can these students and faculty and staff get to where they need to go? I think we can all have a part just in thinking about, you know, there are so many disabilities and they affect our functionality in different ways. So it's hard to sort of come up with a solution for everything, but there are at least, you know, and I'm going to harken back to the legal definitions, but in the US, there are 13 categories of disability. So at least that's a starting point. You know, you can say, what can we do for people with visual impairments? What can we do for people with hearing impairments? What can we do for people who are neurodivergent? And that's another thing, depending on your space. I know that's something we've talked about is having a room that is a little different from a sensory perspective, you know, where the lights can be dimmed, you know, soundproofing, that kind of thing. Because the library is a space where people do tend to spend, you know, they can spend hours at a time. And that might not be the case with every office on campus.
I'll mention too that so I work in counseling services as one of the counselors there, and because of my condition, I've been continuing to see students remotely. So we are offering virtual services for any immunocompromised students, and while I that tends to be the thing that I take the lead in, a lot of our counselors are still offering that. So even if you know students who might be more nervous to show up to something in person, or students who are living off campus who don't come to campus often and are doing more of at home learning, those are options that are available to them as well. So I figured I would just plug that.
That's wonderful. And I think that's an example of how when we sort of design or plan with people with disabilities in mind, it's often going to help people without disabilities as well. Like students who, I can imagine there may be students who wouldn't feel comfortable just because they're afraid of stigma, you know, for seeking mental health assistance, that might feel more comfortable doing getting virtual help. And, you know, one of the other ideas about disability is that, you know, there's this sort of permanent disability, like, for example, my hearing impairment, but there are also just sort of momentary impairments. Like, for example, if I'm carrying boxes or something like that, wheeling a cart full of books or something, then I'm going to take advantage of the wheelchair button things, you know, to get into a building. I think a lot of people use those other than people with who use wheelchairs. And that's something that helps a lot of folks. And then you have people with what we would call sort of temporary disabilities, like someone who maybe has a broken arm, you know, maybe they slipped on some ice, something that's probably fairly common here in Oswego, you know, and broke their arm or broke their ankle. There's been in the literature said a few times that everybody's going to have a disability at some point in their life, whether it's because of something like that, where you break your arm, or just because of age. And I think that's a really meaningful concept to sort of consider. Kyle, I don't know if you saw Pat's question. He's
Yep.
asking whether students have to turn on their cameras
Yep.
when they do a remote session.
Yeah, so usually we ask students to at least show themselves on camera at some point, just so that we can actually have eyes on them. But it isn't something that's required throughout every meeting. There's a lot of students that I've worked with where it's just kind of like the initial meeting, we get to see each other, and then if they aren't comfortable keeping that on, and there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't be comfortable with that. So we try and accommodate as needed. So there are some that I just have phone conversations with, and then there are some who either don't turn their camera on or choose to turn their camera on. So there's different options depending on the level of need, because I think, as you said, Laura, like sometimes that stigma is a real big factor in people seeking out services, and it isn't always easy for them, like physically, to show themselves or to see themselves on Zoom. So I know that that's played a factor in our choices and options. So
Thanks, Kyle.
yep.
I'm really glad to hear that personally. I know John Kane has shared stuff about how it's not a good idea to require that in classes. So I would assume that would extend, because of what you've said, that it would extend beyond the classroom, but to also the other services that are provided on campus. Yeah, I believe. Yes. Does anyone have any other comments they want to share?
I was just curious, you mentioned the accessibility group that you've been a part of. I've been trying to get more involved because it's also a topic that I'm really passionate about and learning a lot more about, but it's been so independent, and I'd like to be able to be a part of things. So I don't know if you know of any faculty or staff groups that would be nice to join in that pursuit of like trying to make things more accessible in general.
I would be happy to, I'm not sure if we're meeting over the summer. I feel like we are. But Casey Raymond in chemistry and Carrie Mosick in extended learning are leading the accessibility work group. And there's a bunch of us, there are some faculty, there are some staff. So that would probably be a great group to be involved with. So if you'd like, I can reach out to them and have them invite you to our next meeting.
Yeah, that would be great.
Marianne, I'm glad to hear that. And I will make sure that John has the link to my slides. So if you guys do want to do any further reading on stuff I've mentioned, that you'll have access to all of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.